Thank you all for coming. Before I introduce our lecturer tonight, I want to remind you all that our next and final lecture will be next week, next Wednesday at this time, and Tom Main from Morphosis will be here delivering that lecture. We're very pleased to have Tom. We realize very much that this is falling squarely in the middle of review week next week, but it was the only time that we'd get Tom to come by, and so we thought we would not want to miss the opportunity. So he'll be here at 4:30, all things being equal, next Wednesday. And plan to come early, because my guess is that there might be a little bit of a crowd here next week. We're going to move that wall back and put in some extra chairs, but even so, I'm expecting a large crowd. Julia Czerniak is a longtime colleague and friend, having joined the faculty at Syracuse in 1995. I've had the pleasure of working with Julia over the years in various academic and administrative capacities. In every way, Julia is a teacher's teacher and a colleague's colleague. For me, she epitomizes what a dedicated and fully engaged member of the faculty should be. Her teaching experience is extensive and includes visiting professorships at such notable institutions as Cornell, University of Pennsylvania, Harvard University, and UCLA. At Syracuse, Julia has taught architectural studios in both the undergraduate and graduate programs, as well as seminars on landscape theory and criticism. Educated both as an architect and a landscape architect, her research and practice focus on the intersection of these disciplines. She received a master's degree in architecture from Princeton University and a bachelor's degree in landscape architecture from Pennsylvania State University. Interestingly, she has also received a research master's of architecture degree from the Mackintosh School of Architecture at Glasgow School of Art in Scotland. Julia is a registered landscape architect and founder and principal with Mark Linder of CLEAR, a transdisciplinary collaborative between architects and others that aspires to both strengthen its disciplinary identity and expand its range of operations. Julia's design work has been recognized with numerous awards. Most recently, her collaborations with Field Operations won the Syracuse Connective Corridor competition. With Marpillo, Polak architect, she won the ArtNet Public Art Landscape Design Competition in Toledo, Ohio, and was also a winner of the 2001 Young Architects Forum competition sponsored by the Architectural League of New York. Her design work for this venue is included in the book Second Nature from Princeton Architectural Press. Her work as a designer is complemented by a body of writing. Julia is editor of two books, Large Parks and Case, Downsview Park, Toronto, which focus on contemporary design approaches to public parks and the relationship between landscape and cities. Other writings include essays in Fertilizer, Eisenman Olin, I love that title, Landscape Urbanism, Assemblage 34, and Harvard Design Review. Julia has exhibited at the Architectural League, the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, the Grant Foundation for Advanced Studies, the Van Allen Institute, Castle Gallery, Galleria Frau, Galleria Joe, and on and on. She has also lectured widely. And finally, before I turn the podium over to Julia, I have a public announcement I would like to share with all of you. And I will read this from a letter recently distributed to the faculty by Dean Robbins, which will be followed later this week by a press release. After an extended national search for a director of Upstate, it is with great pleasure that I am able to announce the appointment of Julia Czerniak as the first director of Upstate. Julia brings to this position an acute eye and sensitivity to urban design, architecture, and landscape architecture. Her work as a designer and theoretician epitomizes the potential impact of landscape architecture and design in our culture. During her years as a member of the faculty, she has consistently demonstrated a commitment to the mission of the school while actively pursuing her research and professional interests. Under her leadership, Upstate promises to become a vital center for innovative design and development strategies for our campus, our city, and the region. Julia will begin her duties as director in the spring semester of 2008, following a research leave in the fall of 2007, during which time she will work on projects as part of CLEAR, including the ArtNet Public Art Landscape Design Competition in Toledo, the Charm Bracelet Competition in Pittsburgh, as well as the Connective Corridor Project in Syracuse. Please join me in welcoming and congratulating Julia Czerniak.
Kelly, can you hear me or should I wear this? Is that okay if I just talked without the mic? Yes? Should I wear the mic?
Yes, wear the mic.
Wear the mic. Okay. There, it's better. So mute. Off.
You gonna walk around?
No,
As if you want.
I won't walk around. I'll stand right here. Yeah, let me, I have to see what I'm doing. Perfect, okay. So when Mark Robbins asked me to lecture in this spring series, it was because that the collection of essays that I edited and contributed to was supposed to be published and out in the world, but as these things go, it just went to press last Friday, so all I have for you is its cover. But I'm going to talk tonight about this research I've been doing on large parks and do three things in about the next 60 minutes. I timed it, so we should be okay. First thing I want to do is discuss the ambitions of this book, setting up a bit the terms of its title. I also want to say a few words about the contributors' essays within it, within this frame. And then lastly, I will talk about my own research, which is the title of this talk, on the concepts of legibility and resilience in large parks. I also want to, for those of you, this research began a while back, but I currently have students here in the school who have been in my landscape seminar, and it's through them that I've been able to process a lot of this material, and their thoughts and writings have contributed to my thinking about it. So I thank you for that. And I also would like to thank former Dean Bruce Abbey, who early on supported me in this work. So this book presents essays on an increasingly hard to define landscape type, which is the park. And two thoughts motivated our work. First, initiating a study of park selected by size cuts across conventional binary categories of classification like historic or contemporary, built or unbuilt, or urban or peripheral, and it enables a review of landscapes not usually considered collectively. So considering, say, Central Park circulation strategies, a 19th century park obviously, and field operations organizational strategies for Freshkills, a 21st century park, provides opportunities to advance thinking about each. Second, the adjective large foregrounds a set of landscape preoccupations that relate in complex ways, such as ecology, public space, processes, place, site, and the city. And although these aspects of the environment are certainly present in smaller parks, a large park both contains the space that promotes their full interaction. And given the number of large parks now being speculated about, designed, and planned, such as Orange County Great Park in California by Ken Smith and a team, Claire Lister's winning design for North Lincoln Park in Chicago, field operations scheme for Singapore Gardens by the Bay, a competition this past summer, and the Park del Rio Manzanares in Madrid by Adrian Huza, who won the competition with a team of Spanish architects. It's clear that a study of large park design, management, and use is certainly timely and necessary. So as a qualifier for parks, size has practical and disciplinary consequences, and as a sole criterion, the term large becomes critical. When Olmsted used the word park, he restricted the meaning to, and I'm quoting him, a large tract of land set apart by the public for the enjoyment of rural landscape. And he distinguished it from promenades or public squares, things that he considered fit for more urbanized pleasure. In lobbying for a larger tract of land for Central Park, Andrew Jackson Downing suggests, and I'm quoting him, 500 acres is the smallest area that should be reserved for the future wants of such a city. In that area, there would be space enough to have the beauty of green fields, the perfume, and the freshness of nature. And in the early stages of America's urbanization, it was easy and relatively inexpensive to acquire such space, of which Downing speaks. And as a result, many 19th century parks were very large scale. Franklin Park, part of Boston's Emerald Necklace, is over 500 acres. The Buffalo Park system links 700 acres. Central Park, over 800 acres. And Philadelphia's Fairmount Park, a very large park, has grown from over 1,000 to over 4,000 acres. So largeness here was necessary to fulfill what was initially understood as the park's primary role, to provide an image of green and the effects of freshness as an anecdote to the industrial city. So this matrix was something that I developed that is comparing the parks that we discussed in the book by their size and their shape. And although we used 500 acres as our initial criteria, that was something that we could challenge. It became provisional for us. So the second term of our title has its own complex history. In a particularly poetic description in their book on Olmsted, Theodore Kimball and Frederick Olmsted Jr. proposed that, and I'm quoting them, whatever the various meanings of the word park, to the cottager of Chaucer's time watching the deer over the paling of the manor woods, to the courtier of Louis XIV philandering through the broad allées of Versailles, it always suggests to us some kind of green open space with turf and trees, like that you see here in Hyde Park with a very elegant chestnut tree. Before the birth of the municipal park movement in Europe in the early 19th century, green open spaces were the property of the nobility, to which the public was occasionally invited. And the Middle English definition of the word tells us that this land was often enclosed for the use as hunting grounds. And Olmsted points out that the character of this land used to support animals would be pastoral, with trees having broad stretches of rich greenswards, things we already accept as convention. Yet the character and images of parks and the roles they play, their emergence relative to cities, and their use by various publics have certainly changed. This evolution suggests a considerable amount of both possibility and polemic surrounding park futures. So large plus parks claims a complex conceptual territory explored in diverse ways by 7 authors. And although the premise that size matters is not complicated, it allows for inquiry at multiple scales and through diverse frameworks that may give rise to new ways of thinking about what parks are, how they look, operate, and are used and sustained. So landscape ecologist Nina Marie Lister begins the collection by exploring how recent shifts in ecological thinking, from perceptions of ecosystems as closed, deterministic structures to ones that recognize living systems as open and self-organizing, affect design and management strategies. Lister's essay, which she calls Ecological Design or Designer Ecology, problematizes these strategies for using complex processes to inform the envisioning and designing of parks. And she differentiates between strategies that result in the symbolic and the educational, those that she says represent nature, and those that facilitate the emergence of self-organizing ecological systems. So the ones that represent nature she calls designer ecology versus ecological design, and they both have places. But an example of designer ecology is this, and it's called Yorkville Park in Toronto, and by Martha Schwartz and Ken Smith. In Uncertain Parks, Disturbed Sites, Citizens and Risk Society, landscape historian Beth Meyer follows on this exploration by ruminating on the contemporary large park made in disturbed places such as abandoned power plants and landfills whose sites are constituted by debris and toxic byproducts of the city. And she sets this up with these montages, I think they're quite beautiful, by Julie Bargman of Dirt Studio, showing a color field of acid mine drainage, and Yellow Boy, which is a rust-covered layer that is a result of AMD. So pointing out the serious aesthetic limitations and ethical implications of conceiving of the public park as what she calls a space of erasure and amnesia, a timeless pastoral dream floating atop the modern city, Meyer offers instead a view of the park as a space of recollecting and interpreting prior stories of the site. This preoccupation with thin green veneers that often constitutes a park's surface and masks its content is elaborated in Matrix Landscape, which is by architect Linda Pollock, which focuses on the Freshkill landfill, the surface of which you see here in Amelie Lederman-Ukele's photograph. Taking the size, and it's interesting, she's the artist in residence for the Department of Sanitation. Taking the size and scale of the Freshkills landscape as a starting point, Pollock's essay examines strategies that engage the dynamic and heterogeneous aspects of a site instead of promoting an illusion of a stable whole. Landscape architect George Hargraves, who is my co-editor in this collection, draws on his experience as a designer and builder and revisits 7 significant large parks from around the world. This revisiting enabled him to speculate on the relationship of these parks to their physical sites, which he positions as the fundamental base of any landscape. Hargraves describes parks that both resist and engage their sites, noting that site characteristics that could be masked and modified at smaller scales are very difficult to disguise across 500 acres. And we could see this in this image of Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. Its design state, this pastoral image, is really not what the park wants to be, what the landscape wants to be. Its natural tendency is that to tend back toward its sand dune state. So he argues that the long-term success of any large park depends on the extent to which designers embrace or fight the physical history and systems of a site. The sensibility of places within parks gets reassessed in landscape theorist Anita Berrizbeitia, who we recently heard, essay called Replacing Process, where she examines potential associations between making places of lasting identity and value and facilitating the processes that transform them. So distinguishing between concepts of place and site, Berrizbeitia proposes a reframing of place that suggests it as at once flexible, emerging, culturally encoded, socially dynamic, and visually powerful. And one example she gives is this image you see. It's Peter Latz's Duisburg Nord Landschaftspark, which accepts the steel production plant largely as is, forming the underlying base into which he strategically inserts new programs and gardens. In Conflict and Erosion, the contemporary public life of parks, critic John Beardsley addresses the multiple, often conflicting publics that use large parks and the possibility of even achieving this idea of the public. From the development of public-private partnerships that increasingly finance and police parks, to the parcelization of space to accommodate the needs of different user groups, to the increasing appearance of private concessions within park bounds, things we all know and live with. The erosion of public space leaves designers of large parks with many challenges. But Beardsley remains convinced that large parks are some of the most reliable places for the interaction of the planned and the unplanned, the sanctioned and the unsanctioned. And he gives example, this is a great image, of barbecuing in Berlin's Tiergarten, something that's actually not allowed but happens every weekend afternoon in the summer, so much so evidently that large plumes of smoke are seen rising from the park in the middle of the day. In Legibility and Resilience, I discuss preoccupations in contemporary park design as formations of the city shift from dominant centers with dependent peripheries to the polycentric metropolis, from parks that emerged in relationship to 19th century industrial cities like San Francisco, when you can clearly see the figure of Golden Gate Park relative to the city, to those that appear after the metropolis, such as this 1,000-acre regional park system that's weaving through the redevelopment of Stapleton Airport in Denver, which is an expanding urban mosaic. Using and revisiting the competition schemes from not so recent anymore international competitions as my case studies, Freshkills and Downsview, I examine how large parks can have significant ecological, social, and generative roles in the contemporary city. These schemes and many large parks of the past share 2 essential characteristics, it seems to me, what I call legibility and resilience. So legibility is a rather straightforward term, referring most commonly to the capability of something to be read or deciphered, such as handwriting. In our discipline, reading design work is more usefully framed as understanding its logics, whether they be textual, biological, or organizational. In the context of large parks, legibility is the capacity of a project to be understood in its intentions, identity, and image. The concept of legibility extends from park design to its design process. In other words, to be realized, parks have to be legible for the people who are using them and paying for them actually to happen. Resilience is a more complex quality. At its most general, it is the ability to recover from or adjust to change. Here, resilience is thought to be a positive attribute, both of character, as in a person, or of behavior, as in a material. As an ecological concept, resilience is the ability of a system to experience disturbance, such as a wind throw event, insect outbreak, or fire, and then return to a recognizable state, or more usefully, the ability of a system to adjust in the face of challenging conditions. The important measure of an ecosystem's resilience is the amount of disturbance it can absorb while still maintaining its function before instabilities flip the system into another regime of behavior, like a grassland becoming a shrub desert. But as a tool for conceptualizing, designing, and managing large parks, for us, it's useful to think of resilience in this ecological sense. A park's capacity for resilience lies in the strategic design of its organizational systems and logic that enables it to absorb and facilitate change, a kind of ecological idea, and shifting desires, cultural ones, all the while maintaining its design sensibility. In a resilient park, what matters is the tension between efficiency and persistence, constancy and change, and predictability and unpredictability. So what follows the intentions of follows is threefold. And first, I'm going to quickly sketch the shifting relationships of the park to the North American city over the last 2 centuries to highlight differences in their contexts and aspirations. Second, I'm going to discuss legibility and resilience in a selection of parks, and finally to elaborate on the roles large parks can play in contemporary cities. So part 1. To discuss large urban parks is by necessity to discuss the city. In her book on park design, Galen Krantz suggests that whatever is decided about the function of parks will largely derive from some vision of the city, and it is by no means obvious how the city is to be viewed, and we're looking at the New York metropolitan area. How the city is viewed as a formal or spatial organization, as an array of programs and events, as a set of problems or opportunities, as a metabolic organism, or as a political and administrative body is crucial to understand the shifting relationship of parks to them. In the half century leading up to the making of Central Park, thanks Randall, I can't see my text, no I can. The vision of New York City's future depicted in this Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which you see up here, is one of hills, streams, ponds, and swamps, which you can sort of see the topography underneath this, over which is superimposed a grid of streets and avenues. The plan allocated only 450 acres, constituted by squares and parade grounds, for parks. And fearing the health problems associated with such unrelieved density, civic leaders began lobbying for larger parks. As I mentioned, such space was readily available in the early stages of America's urbanization, when in many cases parks came before cities. And Central Park's subsequent expansion to over 800 acres was seen as necessary to fulfill the park's primary role of offering relief from the industrial city. And again, this is an outline, my outline of the laying out of the land of the park when the grid of the city is actually just around it. So the detail of Greensward, which is this, Olmsted and Vaux's winning competition scheme for this land, are well known, and I'm revisiting them here simply to make a point, and that is that characterizing Olmsted's philosophy simply as escapist and thinking about the 19th century park as simply separate from the city sort of sets up a false polemic. Problematic because of the many successful strategies that we as designers can still cull from places like Central Park. And although this park was designed to produce the effects of a rural landscape, the park-city relationships that the designers envisioned are more complex than this simple opposition might suggest. And I'll give you a few examples. First, Central Park is both a respite from the city, a place where, in the absence of distraction, nature could produce restorative effects, and a spur to urban redevelopment. Olmsted understood the relationship between building parks and building cities, that the initial cost of land would be compensated for by the development of the park's perimeter, which we certainly see in this sequence over time. Second, the park is both an artificial place made through considerable construction processes and an image of nature, where city functions and facts were screened with lush planting. How it appeared mattered. So you can see the making of the park in the 19th century, the remaking of the green in the late 1990s, and yet despite this making, it still has this certain kind of appearance. Now the park's figural void, which is strongly legible, contributes to its reception as a green object. Long after its social and infrastructural agendas fade from everyone's memory, its image lingers. Finally, the park both accommodates both the functional demands of the future city, such as traffic through sunken transverse roads, and the formal requirements of a picturesque landscape. The first strategy extends the grid, and the second resists it. So Olmsted's brilliant depression of the transverse roads and his separation of circulation paths in plan and section, which you actually saw better in here. I mean, there's this notion of that you could pass by in one form of transportation while the transverse road comes through. Here in the 19th century, people strolling, riding horses and going in carriages, and how it's working in the 21st century, all the while allowing people to flow seamlessly through space. So this sort of brilliant idea of depressing these roads and separating circulation paths in plan and section, for me, enables the park's resilience. It's the sort of first example that I'm giving of resilience, because despite 150 years of programming pressures that have transformed many of the park's green spaces, and I'm calling here programming pressures disturbances, the key sensibility of the park, this notion of the ability for the visitor to flow seamlessly on foot or bike, now on scooter and car, without interruption, still persists. So the urban context for parks has obviously changed significantly since Olmsted's time. In Post-Metropolis, urban critic Ed Soja speculates on the new patterning of urban form that has emerged as a result of globalization. He offers an array of terms to describe these reconfigured spatial conditions: megacity, outer city, edge city, each with landscape implications. I love this image of North America at night to start to illustrate these things. Megacities, or the enormous population size of the world's largest urban agglomerations, are characterized by polycentric spatial structures, and they produce vast urban landscapes where the traditional defining qualities of the city density no longer pertains. And so we could think of Los Angeles and Basin as an excellent example of that. An outer city arises from a process involving the urbanization of the suburbs, with its own spatial condition and lifestyle revolving around the car, the single-family house, and the private garden, giving rise to the privatization of landscape space. And finally, edge city implies a form contingent on malls and office space, which dot the landscape, producing multiple cores. I mean, these terms all describe a loss of the dominance of the metropolis's distinctive organizational form, which implies a rethinking of large urban parks which belonged to them previously. Now, that landscape appears as an element of these urban formations is widely recognized, especially in this country. In the most cited example, Dutch architect Ram Koolhaas uses landscape, as you know, as the descriptor for all of Atlanta, which is pictured here, suggesting that density is here replaced with a sparse, thin carpet of habitations. Its strongest contextuals given are roads and forests. What's interesting, though, is that parks per se, with their association of public funding and social programs and hopefully ecological agendas, account for less than 4% of downtown space within this landscape surplus. So this description raises a question. In a dispersed metropolis where landscape is everywhere, is the urban park at risk? And if it's not, what does it become? What does it do? What's its job? And that's one question that most designers have to address. So if you consider for a moment sites for the 19th century and the 21st century urban parks in North America, pictured by these two maps of New York in 1900 and the metropolitan area in 2000. Whereas the industrial city was characterized by overcrowding, disease, and long work days, the contemporary city is distinguished by an abundance of public and private open space, not overcrowding, and national and global environmental problems, not simply local ones. These characteristics suggest that the current urban context present issues of spatial and social disconnection, fragmented authority, the rise of individual interests, and a lack of identity, which becomes quite a set of challenges for the contemporary park designer. Now, back to Golden Gate Park for a moment. One obvious implication of these different urban contexts is the configuration of new park sites, their shape, their perimeter, and the amount of interior space they have. As I mentioned before, parks that emerge in relationship to or even before the city, such as Central Park and here Golden Gate, have strong figural forms. And back here, 1869, the growth of San Francisco from the east, and the setting in place already of the park and the infrastructure that will support it as the city ultimately grows around it. So the park, again, is before the city. With the irregular parcels of land available in today's cities, such as the decommissioned military bases that make up Downsview Park in Toronto, which you see here. Again, the green system that runs through Stapleton Airport, or post-industrial sites such as this along the Los Angeles River that are further fragmented by the parcelization of space. A park's configuration is more imposed rather than chosen. It's acquired. And this is problematized even further in projects whose designs expand beyond their given lots, such as this scheme, Bernard Shumi's Downsview Park scheme, which proposed linkages beyond the competition boundaries to adjacent river ravines, making the domain of the actual park even less legible. So in addition to questions like of a park's legibility that stem from recognizing its limits, like where's the park, large park schemes with unconventional configurations provoke other uncertainties. The question like how does it look or what can it do require designers to both reconcile the park's visual relationships to its surroundings and foreground how a park works. Ooh, that's a terrible image. The contemporary urban mosaics of which these large tracts of land are a part are often fragmented, as I said, posing challenges from an ecological standpoint regarding corridors and connectivity, which are key components of a landscape's biodiversity. But these irregular configurations are actually assets. Proposed parks with shapes like this one, which is the third time I've shown it to you, resonate with landscape ecologists Richard Foreman's sketch for what he calls an optimal patch configuration, helping to facilitate species dispersion. And there is a great caption that's cut off here, but he talks about the optimum patch configuration as being spaceship shaped with tentacles for dispersion of species. Contemporary large parks also raise questions of density. For example, in Toronto, where private open space is abundant and the population is dispersed, who are the parks for? The site for Downsview Park, which you see circled right here, makes sense only in the context of the Greater Toronto area's anticipated growth by more than 2 million people over the next 20 years. So one of the initial goals of the park, very different from parks in the past, is to help produce density rather than provide relief from it. So large parks in the contemporary city also have to contend with the complex and often contentious histories of their site and undergo an extraordinary amount of public review that gives the planning and design process social, technical, and ecological input. And the schemes most resilient to feedback are the most likely to survive. So I have a few case studies. And the first is New York City and Freshkills landscape. So New York City is an apt context in which to examine how parks might address these contemporary challenges. When Central Park was under construction, here that is in that red circle, as I said, the core of New York's population was 2.5 miles away on the tip. Now the park is thoroughly absorbed in the New York metropolitan area, an agglomeration populated by more than 21 million people, and contains the country's largest landfill, Freshkills, which you see here. As you probably know, Lifescape is the winning scheme for the 2001 design competition for this site. It was led by field operations. The Lifescape project team successfully addressed a set of goals, and that was socially and ecologically. It creates connections at nested scales from the local site to the region, providing for flows of people, water, and wildlife. Technologically, it complies with all landfill regulations while creating phased public use. And aesthetically, the scheme reveals the unique character of the site that, despite its appearance as grassland, is thoroughly urban in its synthetic nature. Now, challenging the conceptual view of the park, where nature is seen as, quote, softly undulating, virtuous, and pastoral, as this image from Franklin Park in Boston, as opposed to the city. So James Corner and his team think of the city as a metabolic machine, or what Sanford Quinter calls a soft system, adaptable, flexible, and evolving through its capacity to absorb and exchange information with its surroundings. Lifescape positions itself as part of this dynamic set of interrelations, where the park is an analog to the city's spatial and temporal interactions. What the Corner team calls their scheme, which is nature sprawl, sponsors a compelling view of nature that they explain is no longer the image we look at, like the one of Franklin Park, but the field we inhabit. And I'm using their language here. Their technological view of nature as a what they call bacterial machine promises to evolve new life form opportunities on Freshkills' sterile terrain that makes use of the logics of natural systems and the dynamics of ecological feedback without, they say, the romantic attachment to the pastoral idea. Their proposal thoroughly outlines a successional strategy to establish a landscape ecology by remediating soil, stabilizing slopes, removing invasives, establishing grassland, introducing woody material, and adaptively managing. Over time, you can see in these phased drawings of like 0 and 10 years, habitat types with many native species will emerge across Freshkills, responding to the specific characteristics of their local site. And again, this is all their description. The result is a landscape that promises interconnectivity of many types. You know, as a landscape proposal, though, Lifescape is believable in its goal to recast Staten Island as its own strong place, no longer reliant on the historic city center. Yet with polemics that so pointedly resist nature-city oppositions, its competition image, which you see here, is unapologetically natural-looking. Not that different, it seems, from the soft and undulating nature of which Corner was critical. I mean, the project could be understood as a restoration effort with a management strategy shored up through the choice to neither index the landfill. They had no desire of letting anybody know that they're, the country's largest trash dump below it, nor reveal in any way landscape's artificiality. However, when you look beyond their perspectival images and you look at their drawings, there's certain things about the plan details of the winning entry, which you see here, like these forest threads that slip off the slope to wrap significant programmatic spaces, or these circular clumps that are in the siltation basins, or the combed earthwork that supports planting. I mean, each suggests in a very subtle way a sort of plasticity and constructedness that's not simply a naturalism. So because, what I think what's really important about this is that field operations is less concerned with their park's image, how it looks, like that perspective I showed you, that aerial, than they are with its identity, which is its distinguishing character. And that's evident in its legibility and resilience. In their competition entry, the team recognized the park's role in repairing ecological damage. They also acknowledged a very important task, and that's to create the constituency that will maintain and nurture this landscape over the long term. And to achieve this, Corner suggests that landscape must be legible to its users, and it's a condition that's less evident in perspective drawing than it is, and I'm quoting him, the cultivated understanding of its evolutionary logic. So their planting strategy promises to enable residents and visitors to the reserve to understand the condition associated with the varied planting communities. And and so you see here, these diagrams of showing, what's growing on the northeast slopes, what's growing on the southwest slope. And actually, in addition to the competition entry, was a very detailed booklet in which all this was described. And he won't repeat it, but one of the things Corner said during the competition presentation is, to know it is to love it, and you have to cultivate that. The scheme's legibility extends to its plan map figure, intended as an early recognized identity tool promoting Lifescape to the public during the planning process. As a design process and plan, Lifescape delivers on these promises. Field Operations Community Outreach Program, which you see here, some examples, has been really ambitious in its scale. They design advertisements for the city's website. They make these posters to announce public meetings, and they design transformable project logos, all in attempts to get people engaged in the fact that the park is happening, and to get people involved, or to describe that kill is actually a Dutch word for stream. And in this one, they're even designing graphics for the side of Department of Sanitation trucks. So these measures are intended to generate a high degree of public interest and stand for a park in planning in recognition of the crucial impact that the legibility of the park and its operations will have on its future life. Now, Lifescape's resilience is the second key component of its identity. The view of nature it embodies, a working system rather than a view, will enable the park, when built, to absorb and react to feedback not under a designer's control, which is a lot of stuff, all the while maintaining its sensibility, which is the capacity to process movement and change through its organizational logic. So for me, Lifescape can be seen as this, a textural field or a pixel map where effects are projected and managed, added to and erased, while retaining overall legibility. Because you can take any of these sort of pixelated pieces away and you still get the effect of the whole. So it's an analog here. In the current master plan, the conceptually driven spatial systems that we all know, these three, threads, islands, and mats, from the competition, have evolved into the more conventional terms of activities, habitat, and circulation, having succeeded at evolving the design. So sort of they've done their work, and now they can move on. So I want to briefly talk about Toronto and Downsview Park. So the strategies for this park, which is the Government of Canada's first national urban park, reiterate and expand on these concepts. The morphology of Toronto can be understood as the successive generations of development radiating from its historic center, which is here. When the Air Force Base was built, it was on the periphery of the city, and now it's completely absorbed in the middle of what's known as the GTA, Greater Toronto Area, which is an urbanized territory of about 4.5 million people. The Downsview lands are a large redevelopment site within this urban expanse, 640-acre void that's edged by aging post-war housing and industry. And the park is actually half of that size, 320 acres, but the redevelopment that funds the park is the other 320. And the competition was based on seemingly antithetical goals. On the one hand, the parklands are centrally located in the midst of one of the city's, and I love this term, suburban intensification areas. And the park is to play an integral role in the city's attempt to intensify itself. And on the other, the park is to be a model of ecological and economic sustainability. And the conurbation, of which the site is a part, corresponds to the Greater Toronto bioregion, and the park presents a major opportunity to contribute to the city's system of green spaces. So you see the park here in a larger structure. And because the city sits on a high point between two river systems, the Don and the Humber, and which are two of the larger regional watersheds. And its adjacency to these ravines suggests the possibility of connecting to them and enhancing flows of water, habitat, and wildlife within them. So Tree City, I need to revisit briefly. I know we've seen this a lot. We all recognize it was the winning scheme for the project. It was led by graphic designer Bruce Mao with Rem Koolhaas, and it's now well known as this diagram for growing a park. It was positioned within a supposed history of Toronto spending very little money on green space. It promised to become a green destination for recreation, infrastructure that increases value, and help in suburban densification. And it was advocated as, well, this was one of the 7 boards for the competition, as more of a formula than a design, which they say was a pragmatic response to unknowable conditions. The formula suggested the emergence of the park at 2 scales. Here, the site scale, the scheme begins with soil preparation that supports forests, meadows, playing fields, and gardens, and with lots of paths within it for varied use. And later, at the city scale, landscape clusters promise extension into adjacent areas, weaving into the suburban fabric. Now, almost 7 years after winning the competition, which is that, Tree City has evolved from a polemic to a plan for land that has still to be completely acquired for the Defense Department. And this is no small matter, because it is an index of the slow progress, ambiguous vision, and sometimes contentious process that the planning for the park has experienced. Yet Tree City can still be seen as performing. This is the interim master plan that was unveiled by Mao, I think 2 years ago now. And it vaunted the theme of 600 acres of ecologic, economic, and social sustainability. And he characterized these as 3 zones: the action zone, the promenade, and the cultivation campus. Right now, if you go to the site, there's a modest test plot of 30 acres. That's an urban reforestation test. And a comprehensive plan, master plan, was just released this summer. And what's interesting here is that not only are you seeing the park design, but you're seeing all of the development for all of the urban design that's going to finance that park. So, however slowly, each iteration fills in the gaps of the previous ones. Shortly after the competition, the clusters, or dots as we saw them, that appear in the scheme and its representation generated a lot of speculation. In one way, the dots allow the park to be understood in its intentions, organizations, and imagery. And of course, I'm getting back to this idea of legibility. The circle pattern makes implementation easy in that whatever goes into the park takes this form. Tree City's resilience is linked to this legibility. The circle pattern that gives the park its identity is also resilient in the interchangeability of the circles. You can move them around from space to space. It doesn't really matter if it's here or here or here or here. And its material specificity is totally open. It could be a tree massing, it could be a water pool, it could be an urban surface, it could be a building. To most important, the capacity of the parts of the park system to stay closed to disturbance, which stabilizes the design, and others to be continually affected by it. And this is a reading that was brilliantly made by Nita Berzbaitia. So to sort of paraphrase that, we can think of these dots as closed to the disturbances that the rest of the park, as it evolves, is open to. So what that enables is that multiple agendas for park design. You can have, as Anita argues, a representational agenda that encodes meaning and value into certain things that are kind of static, and you can have an ecological agenda at different scales. So they can both coexist in the same place at the same time. Now, I find this interesting. It's not new to our discipline. It's not even surprising. It's just a little repressed. For example, you can think of these tree clusters in this 18th century landscape garden, Blenheim. One can imagine that these topographic field conditions within the park, and again, it's very interesting, these tree clusters, we get these tree clusters, as a way to guide stormwater, nurture native plant communities, and encourage species diversity, sort of an ecological agenda, while the tree clusters remain neatly trimmed and maintained in circles. And in this case, it's by sheep that graze there. But one could imagine that that notion of becoming more static allows other agendas of representation and meaning. So this distinction between elements that are static and elements that play provisional roles is essential to a park's resilience. So I want to close by showing you some more recent designs that I think are engaging these concepts in interesting ways. So Central Park, Lifescape, and Tree City, as I've shown, sponsor a conceptual framework of legibility and resilience. And these three projects take the concepts, I think, further. This is called Assembled Ecologies Infrastructure a la carte, which is the winning scheme for North Lincoln Park in Chicago by Claire Lister and a team. And it proposes an organizational system based on the dimension of a Chicago block, even though it's at a different orientation than the city. The organization of the park through an infill mechanism of 5 morphologies of what they call mats, or modular infrastructural tiles, enables resilience in a way that lets various stakeholders make individual statement on their tile without compromising the vision for the park. So, the team argues that this resilience is political, and it's actually interesting to see this word resilience coming up in a lot of the text used by the designers. This resilience for her is political, recognizing the complex and competing interests of various constituencies, and for them, enabling the production of contemporary public space. Like Tree City, the organizational system that enables the scheme's resilience is optically legible, in that everything that goes into the park takes its form. And one of my students last night also pointed out to me that this notion of this lagoon sensibility is actually echoing Olmsted's work in South Park. In field operations scheme for Singapore Gardens by the Bay, resilience is enabled by the organizational structure of the overlaid circular geometries, creating a large rolling topographic surface within which various programs can be nested. However, it's the organizational logic of porosity that happens at numerous scales is the innovation here. So various materials are allocated to different surfaces and allows them to perform in very different ways, thereby lending an overall resilience to the field as a whole, but with maximum variation and flexibility within the parks. So glass, turf, concrete, and stone, used in various combinations, suggest infinite exchangeability based on user wishes, cost, site specificity, or lifespan. In other words, where materials perform, not signify, the only criteria is porosity. And moreover, stormwater is processed within the various pores of the surface, flowing from one to the next in a succession of appearance and disappearance. And finally, the reforestation strategies, for the park is based on the same organizational geometries, layering species to produce a rich textural canopy. The legibility of Hargraves Associates and Morphosis' scheme for Orange County Great Park is based on an understanding of its site-specific logic. Its resilience resides in a middle scale of organizational logic that addresses the large, complex nature of its 1,000-acre site. And each of their 5 driving what they call constituencies, I don't really see other constituencies, but nature, activity, culture, infrastructure, and sustainability. Although they're not organizational systems themselves, they rely on various logics to govern their formation and evolution. For example, nature is constituted by landscape types such as grassland, irrigated fields, riparian systems, and productive plots. Activity is conceived as subsystems of patches, which are these irrigated pads with embedded services, and strips, which you see here and here, that accommodate sports and recreation. So you've got your pads and your strips, and you could have, a lot of different variations of those. And finally, infrastructure, which is divided into the fixed and the flexible, recognizing the difference between aspects of a park instrumental to its long-term function and that which is more open to changed configurations based on user wishes, economies, and politics. So conceiving of the park in this way, even when not evident in its plan arrangement, is a strategy of resilience. So I want to end with some ideas that I call large parks projecting futures, about the possibilities that these parks, the roles these parks can play in the contemporary city. So large parks can play vital roles in the city in three ways, and their legibility and resilience are measures of their ability to do so. First, as social catalysts, the schemes I've discussed promise contact and exchange for people in otherwise disjointed urban environments through an array of spaces, activities, and circulation systems. Kind of blurry. So in these extensive lists that come along with every competition we see now of invariably conflicting programs that accompany all these proposals, one can find amenities such as daycare centers and community gardens, places that could enlarge the range of social functions performed by parks. And historian Galen Krantz writes about this. Furthermore, the processes by which these parks emerge imply a social dimension where the public grows and learns through design process. Environmental interests, say the president of wildlife corridors, have to be balanced with often conflicting desires, such as activity spaces, and the interactive process of feedback and exchange between invested constituencies, as well as the design's ability to accommodate these conflicting wishes, is a measure of its legibility and resilience. Second, as ecological agents, these parks promise in diverse ways to act more like hearts than lungs, enabling life through an ecological investment. By their size and configurations, these schemes facilitate interconnectivity across the fragmented landscape, responding to the threat that urban expansion poses to landscape biodiversity. These parks are places where designers can develop constituencies that will understand and maintain them, because the aspirations of their large park in their city are legible to them. Furthermore, these parks work ecologically, not just look like they do. Resilience here is the literal capacity to recover and adjust from storms, pests, disease, fire, and other natural disturbances. Lastly, parks continue to be what Galen Krantz calls imaginative enterprises, keeping on hold values threatened by the facts of city life until culture can reincorporate them by showing the difference between itself, the park, and an ordinary reality, the world. Parks can be places for imagination to extend new relationships and sets of possibilities. Here, parks are places to project futures, and resilience is a measure of their ability to hold competing ones. As such, how these parks appear matter. They must look different from the surrounding contexts, or they and their agendas are simply not recognizable, and legibility is part of identity building. Thank you very much.
Julia is willing to take some questions if there are any, please.
Any questions? Anne.
My question has to do with, I guess when we go back to the interesting way you started the lecture by talking about the two words, large parts. I was thinking about the word publics, and financial support for parks. And I was wondering if, I'm thinking about other things like ballparks, and the private entities, sort of private public entities that get involved there. I'm just wondering how the public monies that support some of these, or private monies in some cases, form and affect the kind of flows that you described in many of these parks. Now, I can imagine discontinuities just based on funding or lack of funding. If you could address
What's interesting,
stuff.
you'll have to read John Beardsley's chapter because he talks all about this. But yes, they're, nested within each of these are, let's just say, islands of private use that range in terms of access. A student yesterday in my seminar just did this great drawing that talked about, color-coded the levels of, let's say, public access to various of these internalized programs. So that happens in the world now, like in most parks. It has not really been problematized in these design schemes. So, but I could certainly see an opportunity for us to think about it that way, right? Recognizing that there will be various kinds of investments that would create sort of enclaves. But I think that would be actually a very interesting design problem. But it's not really addressed proactively in the designs. Like John Beardsley's going back and reading like what's happened to the Bois de Boulogne in Paris in terms of the racetrack, or some of the parks in Mexico that charge different fee structures for going into different levels of a park, right? From being on the periphery for more recreational use to going to an interior. So these things are in place, but not necessarily being activated by designers. But I think it's really interesting territory. Anyone else?
Anybody else?
Good. Well, thanks a lot. Oh, wait, Ted. Oh, Ted and Ann.
You can't get off that easy.
Returning to the issue of legibility, it seems to me that you make a strong argument for a kind of figural legibility of a 19th century park, early 20th century park. It seems that most of the legibility of the 21st century park has to do with repetition. The small circular figures, in a way, proliferate and allows us to understand it as park or it as other than city. Do you think that's fair?
No, because I would say that, Freshkills, its legibility has everything to do with kind of a cultivated understanding of its logics. And so it has nothing to do with form, like that way, as an applied organizational system. I think their resiliences do, and it's actually Tree City where legibility and resilience is a kind of very nuanced relationship between them. But I think in Freshkills there's really different strategies between what makes it resilient in terms of it being designed through organizational logics, and what makes it legible through getting people to understand how the park grows and works. So I think they're really different. So, all of their promotional work for the park is all part of that campaign, it seems to me. But, the ones that certainly with Corner's work, that I think, like the Singapore Gardens, it's learning a lot from Tree City, in terms of those systems. And Claire Lister's project, there's a kind of overlay. But I think with Hargraves and Tom Maines and Jim, I think they're different.
Truly. I think it's fair to say that we live in a very simple age. You don't have to agree with me about it. But in the context, these projects that you're showing here are extremely optimistic, I think. And in contrast to, contradistinction to civicism and surroundings, when you consider issues of public processes and public investment or non-public investment and environmental degradation. We love our SUVs. And so I wonder...
He's talking about himself.
In that context, how do you see, for instance, environmental concerns and issues of sustainability that seem to be, the point is not completely cynical, seem to be picking up, there seems to be some momentum that's developing around those kinds of issues. How is that either driving the development of these kinds of projects, or how are these projects in some way contributing to the...
Well, I think they're driving the projects, right? Because we're dealing with, in many cases, brownfield sites that need to be remade. So built into using this land are these processes of cleanup or these processes of reuse that it's going to embed the environmental agenda. And I think designers are getting creative with it, right? So I don't think designers per se are leading that. I think it's following some opportunities that are arising in the kind of post-industrial city. Okay. Aaron, I knew Aaron would ask me.
I'll just read
You can just talk. You don't need that little.
It's always nice to talk to Mike. Julia, it looks to me that like when you talk about large parks, actually it's all about those parks in terms of extensivity.
About what?
Extensivity, the work in extensivity on the territory. And after all this follows pretty well the logic of the modern city, right? But I'm more curious about what would be the future of parks, and I was wondering if it would be about intensity instead of covering the territory.
Well, I think it depends on what roles you want it to play, right? I mean, I think that for ecological roles, extensivity is a good thing, right? But other kinds of agendas, that can be challenged. So, you know, it seems to me that it's also the territory that's opening up for these parks and how land is being claimed and for what agendas that's, you know, bringing all of this work to bear. I mean, why can't you have points of intensity within fields of extensivity, right?
No, it's more about the fact that when you are presenting those parks, then you are zooming in and out. And I'm kind of like wondering if actually the future of the park is not at the molecular level. In other words, if it wouldn't be actually about looking into how landscape designers are now working with bioengineers, because I think that maybe this is where we would actually shape a different perception on
You
nature.
go next door
Yeah.
to network. I went and looked at this before I came over here. It's like at the level of the test tube, which I know was yours, but is that where parks are going? I don't know. That's a good place to end. Okay, good. Thanks, everybody.